Claire Montgomery stood and arched her back to relieve the tension in her muscles. Her sweat-dampened blue gingham dress clung to her slim body. She'd spent the morning bent over a large cast-iron pot, doing the week's washing. She hated the chore, especially in the heat of summer. Sighing heavily, she pushed a strand of fiery red hair that had escaped its binding and fallen into her eyes. A slight smile pulled at the corners of her mouth as Bartholomew, a large orange tabby who was sleeping on the porch beside her, opened his one good eye and glared at her. "Sorry to have disturbed your nap, Bart," she chuckled. He closed his eye and immediately fell back to sleep. "It must be nice," she thought. She raised a hand to shield her eyes from the blinding sun as she glanced across the small yard in front of her cabin. The silhouette of a man on horseback shimmered on the horizon. Thinking her eyes might be playing tricks on her in this heat, she blinked and looked again. The image was still there. "Tobias!" she called. A large, middle-aged black man stepped out of the barn. "Did you call me, Miss Claire?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. Pointing toward the horizon, she added, "There's a rider coming." Tobias turned to look in the direction she pointed. The approaching rider was slumped forward in the saddle. "He don't look too good," he commented. "I best ride out to meet him." He turned and disappeared inside the barn. A few moments later he reappeared leading a bay mare. Mounting quickly, he kicked the horse into a trot and started toward the man. Claire watched as Tobias approached the rider. Her mind hummed with curiosity. Her reputation as a healer was well known, and as a result they frequently had visitors. However, she knew all the townsfolk, and none of them rode a horse as fine as this one. "Hello?" Tobias called out as he approached the visitor. There was no answer. The man didn't appear to be conscious. His horse slowed as Tobias neared it. Without warning, the man slid from the saddle and landed face down. Tobias jumped off his horse and hurried toward him. He rolled the man over and shook his head in dismay when he saw the amount of blood saturating his shirt. Seeing the man fall, Claire spun around and hurried inside the cabin. She immediately started a pot of water boiling and gathered up her remedies. The man was obviously injured. She knew Tobias would bring him to her. She glanced up as his giant shadow fell across the room. He stood in the doorway holding the man in his arms. "How badly is he hurt?" she asked. "Looks like he's got several bullet holes," Tobias answered. "He's out cold." "Put him on the table and let me take a look," Claire instructed. Tobias nodded and strode to the long dining table in the middle of the room. He gently laid the man down. Claire reached for the buttons of his shirt. Suddenly a hand snaked out and snatched one of her delicate wrists. She sucked in a breath as his hand tightened painfully. Her gaze flew to the man's face. Gray eyes, glazed with fever, stared straight into hers. Tobias stepped to the table, ready to pull Claire out of the man's grip. A second later, he loosened his hold on her and dropped back into unconsciousness. Claire and Tobias exchanged a brief look. Then Claire returned to the task of removing his shirt. "Sit him up," she instructed when she'd reached the last button. Tobias gripped the stranger's shoulders and pulled him into a sitting position. The man groaned, but didn't regain consciousness. Claire began removing the blood-soaked shirt, noting that several of the wounds were still oozing, which indicated they were fresh. However, much of the blood had already dried, causing the shirt to stick to the man's chest and back. In spite of the care she was taking, blood began to pour from several of the holes as she pulled the shirt away from his body. As soon as the shirt slid free, Tobias lowered him back to the table. Claire turned to retrieve the kettle of boiling water. She poured some of the water into a shallow bowl. After allowing it to cool for a few moments, she dampened a linen cloth and gently pressed it to the man's chest. So much blood covered his torso, it was impossible to determine the extent of his injuries. The man's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. With the amount of blood he'd lost, Claire was surprised by the strength she felt beneath her hand. She'd treated many bullet wounds in her lifetime. Usually the flesh felt like dough. He was firm beneath her touch. "He's extremely fit," she mused. "He's gonna need that strength to recover from this."